welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this month's Climate Live K12 session for students, educators, and the public, which is a video series brought to you by the Columbia Climate School. My name is Laurel Zimashihi, and I will be facilitating today's session. I work on K12 and continuing education at the Columbia Climate School. So this is one of many initiatives that we have to bring the research and scholarship of the school out into the public. So for those of you that are unfamiliar with the Columbia Climate School or are joining us for the first time, the school was founded in July 2020, and it's Columbia University's first new school in 25 years and the first climate school in the country. We're dedicated to advancing transdisciplinary climate research, and as a hub for innovative climate solutions, the Climate School brings together experts from across fields to address the most pressing climate challenges of our time. The Climate School is committed to shaping future leaders to drive climate solutions forward in every sector by offering educational programs for degree-seeking students, high school students, teachers, professional learners, and the public. And by equipping change makers with knowledge and skills, the Climate School empowers essential stakeholders in the fight for a just and prosperous society on a healthy planet. So what we're hoping to do with these Climate Live K-12 sessions is introduce you to all the interdisciplinary work through our scientific experts, students, and practitioners across the school. So these are monthly sessions. They're run throughout the academic year from 2025 through 2026. For this year, our last session will be in June, and each month focuses on a certain topic and will be directed towards a particular age range. So for today's session, it's focused on Biodiversity Finance 101. The accelerating loss of biodiversity is not only an ecological crisis, it's a financial one. Natural systems underpin global markets, from food and water to infrastructure resilience, so supply chain reliability and public health. Yet, these dependencies remain largely invisible in traditional financial analysis. By reframing ecosystems as a critical economic asset rather than an externality, we can unlock new models of value creation that strengthen both environmental and financial resilience. Today's talk is led by Turner Watkins, a master's student in sustainability management, and we're going to explore how biodiversity risk is rapidly reshaping investment strategies, regulatory frameworks, and corporate governance. The goal is to equip you all with a clear understanding of how capital can accelerate and benefit from biodiversity restoration. So I will just mention that we have a Q&A opportunity at the very end. So if you have any questions, feel free to use the Q&A button to type those in, but you'll notice that the chat is disabled. All right, so without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Turner. Thank you so much.
Hi, thank you. I'm really excited to be here today. Just pop my screen up real quick. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Biodiversity Finance 101 today. Thank you all for being here. So we're here to talk about biodiversity finance, what it is, why it's needed, and where it will take us. We often hear about climate change these days, but that biodiversity loss is an interconnected issue with just as many implications as things like rising sea levels, changes in long-term temperature trends, and other shifting climate trends. But again, it's interconnected, right? Increasingly, governments, investors, and companies are all asking the question, how do we finance the protection of nature? So a little bit about me. I've often asked myself also who I am. But my name is Turner Watkins. I'm currently in the master's program in sustainability management at Columbia. And I also have a background in geoscience. More recently, I've worked on some climate risk and resilience projects with MSCI. Also, yeah, I popped my email up if anybody has any questions for after the presentation, please don't hesitate to reach out. So why does biodiversity matter? Let's start with a simple question. What would happen if all the bees disappeared? I'll give you a second to think about it. You can see a short definition of biodiversity on the screen because means something different to everyone. But let's circle back to bees. So bees and other pollinators are essential for a lot of the foods we eat, everything like from blueberries to almonds. If it's flowered, it's affected by bees. In the US alone, bees add more than $240 billion in economic value. Um, and pollination is just one example of what economists call these ecosystem services. Research by S&P Global found that 85% of the world's largest companies depend directly on nature in their operations. Think about industries like agriculture, food and beverage, pharmaceuticals, construction, and of course, tourism. All of these industries depend on ecosystems. In fact, more than half of global GDP depends on nature in some way. So protecting nature is just as much about economic stability as it is protecting wildlife. But here's where the word crisis comes in. So since 1970, the world has seen a horrendous 73% decline in the average size of global wildlife populations. Scientists track almost 35,000 animal populations globally to measure this trend. And this decline is caused by things like habitat destruction, deforestation, pollution, climate change, and overfishing. So again, you can see all the interconnectedness of these issues. So because of the biodiversity crisis, governments and other institutions have begun to coordinate global conservation efforts. One of the biggest right now is called the 30 by 30. The goal is to protect 30% of land and ocean by 2023. So more than 190 countries have agreed to work toward this goal. These look at protected areas such as national parks, marine reserves, wildlife refuges, and some of the most effective tools that we have in order to preserve biodiversity. But conservation requires money, right? So scientists and economists together estimate that the world needs hundreds of billions of dollars more than is already allotted to protect biodiversity every single year in order to protect properly the ecosystems that we rely on. And this gap between what we spend and what we need is what we call the biodiversity funding gap. So where does the rest of the money come from? Closing this gap requires more than just government spending. It requires banks, investors, insurance companies, venture capital, development finance institutions, and many more. And so that is where biodiversity finance comes in. So what is biodiversity finance? Biodiversity finance, put simply, means using financial tools to protect and restore nature. So instead of treating conservation as a cost or as an externality, like Laurel mentioned, biodiversity finance tries to make it an investment. Examples include things like green bonds that finance conservation. It could be tools like loans for sustainable agriculture, insurance programs that protect ecosystems. It can also take the form of investment funds focused on nature restoration. If you'd like to learn more, please look at the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. And in practice, this takes a lot of forms. For instance, in Hawaii and Florida, you have coral reef insurance pilots. So when a storm damages reefs, insurance payouts can fund rapid restoration work. Another example comes from forest restoration. Financial institutions like JP Morgan are beginning to invest in projects that restore forests and generate carbon credits. So in JP Morgan's example, they support a deal to finance forest restoration through a company called Chestnut Carbon. And by providing this funding, then other companies have a way of launching these pilot projects that hopefully expand over time. Biodiversity finance also appears in areas like agriculture. So as I briefly mentioned before, banks and development organizations now offer things like sustainable agriculture loans that will help farmers adopt environmentally friendly practices. These loans support things like soil conservation, regenerative agriculture, reduced pesticide use, water conservation, and really provide farmers with the capital they need, while also encouraging those same farmers to put in place practices that protect biodiversity. So, what is the future of biodiversity finance? So, there are many different actors involved in biodiversity finance today. These range from governments who fund conservation programs to development banks supporting large environmental projects to commercial banks and asset managers financing restoration and sustainable agriculture. And then now venture capital firms are hopping on the bandwagon and are beginning to fund what they call nature tech startups that develop new technologies for monitoring and restoring ecosystems. So the biodiversity finance ecosystem can also include organizations like non-governmental organizations, which is a loose term for covering pretty much anything that's not public or private. It's somewhere in the middle. Um, and then, of course, development finance institutions. So if you're going to take three things away from today, it'd probably be this. One, the stability of food systems, water supplies, and even financial markets depends on healthy ecosystems. As biodiversity loss accelerates, financial risks are becoming more visible. The challenge is for all of us, really figuring out how to redesign the economy so that protecting nature is not just the right thing to do, but also a profitable thing to do. Um, and that's all I had for today. I hope this was helpful, and let's get into some questions. I actually have a few here. Is again a very high level overview, but hopefully a good place for people to start. Um,
Great. Thank you. Thanks, Turner. Yes, so if there are any questions, feel free to use the Q&A to put them in, and then we will ask them live. Okay, great. So we have our first question is, how seriously do major banks take these ideas?
well, right, that's a great question, and it really depends on what the structure is. So there's a lot of different ways to structure these pro biodiversity or biodiversity enabled financial tools. Um, so depending on what kind of what they call financial vehicle you're proposing is used, they take them very seriously. There's a lot of, for instance, student competitions out there that focus um, on using students' ideas to bring around kind of the next era of what we would call biodiversity finance. So if you look at like the Kellogg Morgan Stanley Sustainable Investment Challenge, um, there are, the same challenges run out of MIT, and Harvard, and Columbia has a few of our own that we sponsor. So the result of those is often, the judges of those competitions take the suggestions to heart, because we're living in unprecedented times, and if there is a way to do these investments that have financial return and this double pronged environmental or biodiversity benefit, then people do take that very seriously. Now, it does depend on which bank and how you're approaching it, but there's a lot of avenues to get those ideas to the market.
Great. One of the things that I saw in your slide deck was investing in forest protection or restoration for
Hmm.
carbon credits. And I wanted to get your take on that because carbon credits have been criticized because if we are using offsets to continue pumping more and more emissions, then we're not actually lowering the emissions that we need to mitigate climate change. And so a lot of people are saying offsets are being weighed really heavily as a priority among companies. But at the end of the day, we should be prioritizing decarbonizing companies as opposed to offsetting and just continuing to pump more emissions. So I just wanted to get your take on that and how, like, what is the appetite for this as a primary solution for many companies? And is there any shift towards more decarbonization?
I think the key there really is in like, is the shift going to be fast enough? So yeah, sort of when you hear people talking about additionality in the carbon markets, what they're talking about is how much of this carbon is actually being removed from um, the the atmosphere or from man-made causes more so than what is already being done naturally. And so the true answer is that I don't know. It's somewhere. The answer is really in where the future takes us. When companies want to remove carbon from their carbon footprint, they typically do the cheapest thing that they can do. And so in the US, we have, some sort of voluntary carbon market where it's not really enforced by regulation. There's not really any penalties for um, non-participation, but companies whose investors care and whose leadership really cares, they do make it a priority, from what I've seen, to launch something, right? And that something could just be a starting place. It could be a what they call kind of like a placeholder carbon tax, and that's what countries like Japan do. Is they're implementing a placeholder carbon price, and then they ramp it up over time so that industry can keep up and they don't hamper economic growth. So anytime you're talking about like nature finance or biodiversity finance, I think keeping in mind the kind of dual spirit between wanting to maintain economic growth and also, how do you continue economic growth, um, and decouple that from the emissions that have been traditionally associated. Hopefully, does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think it's
Follow up.
you're right. It's just it's a tricky one. Okay, we have a few more questions here in the chat. So, do you see a trend of banks integrating green initiatives into their core investment, or do they treat them as a separate compliance?
Their core investment. So far, again, it really depends on the bank. Um, there are green banks who ostensibly prioritize things like biodiversity finance projects more than investment banks or other more traditional financial institutions. Um, but it really depends. It really depends on the leadership and on the investor side. There's not kind of a at least there's no generalized answer that I know, on whether banks really do that. It's super kind of institution specific.
Thanks. Given the scale of the issue, how viable is this for the insurers and who are the underwriters?
How viable is it for the insurers? Um, so the when it comes to economics, the name of the game is having the most information. And the same goes for insurance. Insurance does a lot of work to collect data and to have climate models and climate forecasts that are as accurate as possible so that they know how to charge people um, as accurately as possible. And they're not going to um, they're going to do their best to not put themselves in a position where they have to spend a lot of money funding repairs from climate change if they haven't already kind of gotten that those costs paid for up front through kind of regular insurance, mechanisms. So there are a few insurance companies I know for sure. Munich Re is the insurance company that worked with Hawaii and Florida and the tourism businesses there. Um, they're a German-based insurance company, and they do a lot of work with on the insurance side in terms of helping to, because insurance is a big part of these financial or investment vehicles too. So definitely check them out. They have a lot of tools and a lot of resources to learn more about what they do on kind of their own domains.
To piggyback off that question, outside of like tours like biodiversity tourism, I'm thinking about insurance in terms of home insurance, let's say in California after wildfires, or flood insurance in,
Hmm.
the Gulf. Do you think there's ever a world in which like insurance companies would invest in ecosystem restoration if it means that they're the people that they insured might be more resilient to some of these disasters, so then they don't end up like losing more money out of pocket for themselves? Or do you think they're just going to pull out entirely? Like what we've been seeing is many of these
Yeah,
very high risk places, you just have to self insure because there is no opportunity for like traditional insurance.
right. From my experience, I have seen obviously both. In the US in particular, it's that there's a lot of still a lot of those games being played with like how much an investment is it's hard to make really the business case for some of these investments given that there's a lot of kind of political instability when it comes to things like biodiversity. So in the US, yeah, I mean there's a lot of just pulling out by the insurance companies. Um as for like investing in some of these biodiversity finance projects to protect their assets, that's exactly like kind of the ongoing struggle is companies are still really trying to understand like what their risk is. Um, and the thing about risk is that it's never static. It's always changing quite a lot. So um, that's when a lot of these climate um, the climate scenario and risk analysis tools come in. Is those tools lay out a range of different paths for companies to evaluate, and based on different assumptions of will we have a carbon tax, will we have a carbon price, um, what sort of regulatory measures will be put in place. Um, all of those things inform these strategies. And with all the shakeups at the regulatory level, companies, particularly insurance companies, I think in the US are more hesitant um, to really invest in a lot of those unless they have a lot of their assets like really close together, um, and then if it's very easy to make the business case. But um, a lot of these insurers operate kind of um, in different pockets, and it's hard to um, it's often hard, believe it or not, for a lot of these companies to work together to find solutions that work for everyone, because there's still a lot of very very with what they call siloed behavior and just working within your niche, looking at just your assets when really, yeah, the kind of one of the best mitigation strategies really would be to work with a lot of these other institutions, um, to make sure that their assets aren't being um, left unprotected or stranded.
Yeah, when it comes to climate action, we know, and it's been proven that collective action is the most powerful way to really make change. And yet it does become very challenging because it is so siloed. But talking about our political climate, we have a question that asks, would you say that our current political climate has slowed the progress of sustainability financing in the US? Do you know if it's growing in other developed countries?
It is certainly growing in other developing and developed countries alike. Um, a lot of the rules are very region specific. In the US, the question hasn't gone away by any means, but it's still like the question is always like, will this investment pay off? And so for anyone who's interested in making that business case, that's certainly part of the, if I can dare to call it, an art that we learn in some of these master's programs through the climate school. It's like, yeah, understanding what investors need in order to invest, and understanding what is needed in terms of the sustainability space. Um, that is an ongoing challenge with lots of unanswered questions. But um, I would say one of the biggest things is like, without policy tools like the investment tax credit for a lot of like renewable energy projects. Um, Certainly that, that was on the energy side of the climate change and also biodiversity crisis question. Um, but in terms of much more biodiversity specific questions, um, it's certainly hampered because there isn't federal investment in you know metaphorical or literal investment in the biodiversity crisis.
Yeah. And I would just also add that, the Inflation Reduction Act that was implemented in Biden's administration, it focused so heavily on both climate adaptation and mitigation in a way that was prioritizing economic growth for, I mean,
Mhm.
of course, there's benefits, there's, biodiversity protection and ecosystem restoration, but the main focus was, look, if we want to be prepared for the climate impacts that we're experiencing, prevent loss and damage, and also ensure energy independence, then we need to grow in these areas. And so many of that has been rolled back for, not just renewable energy, but EVs. And we're also seeing this in administration is destroying public lands to continue to extract resources. And so
Yes.
these impacts are going to have long-term ripple effects, I fear.
And that's the thing. The Inflation Reduction Act in itself, it was, an investment, right? It's like that's very much what it was. And anytime you kind of short stop an investment after it's already been kind of initialized, um, not only you're not going to see the long-term gains from that, but a lot was poured into it as well. Companies began to ramp up operations in order to meet that anticipated demand, and then it was all slashed. So that's another huge risk
Yeah.
that's really important to think about. Absolutely.
And the irony was so much of the economic growth was going to be happening in red states because they just have the
Yeah.
capacity for so much renewable energy. So, um,
Yeah.
yeah, I think so many people don't even realize the loss that we had from that. Okay, our last question, and I know we're butting right up to the end of our session here, but um, could you explain in more detail how the value of biodiversity is assessed? So take bees, for example, their value varies depending on the species and the ecosystem they inhabit. So how is the value of bees defined?
Oh, yeah, that's an excellent question. Um, I'm not entirely sure on the bee example. Um, there's a lot of there's a lot of different tools to evaluate these ecosystem services value. Um, and if to be completely honest, there's none of them are right. None of them are, some of them are wrong, but the goal is to get is to have just a demonstrated value. So it's not going to be the complete value in the same way that, you know, the markets aren't perfect. They are they're an estimation of all of the benefits from the agricultural production, from, the all the associated environmental um, positive impacts that result from bees being around. I would, yeah, highly encourage you to look more into it. And then you have my email, so please drop me a note and tell me what you find, because I would love to learn more about that as well. Yeah, be curious.
Great. Yeah, I know I mean, it's so difficult, right? Like right now we think of costs and gains in a dollars and cents manner, but there's a true
Yeah.
cost that also includes the ecosystem services. That's so hard to put a dollar number on, but I know that there are really sophisticated models out there that try and do that. Um, Someone asked, if we gather information on biodiversity globally, is it possible to use artificial intelligence to create a risk assessment framework? Do governments, like investors, act based on risk? And furthermore, do we define the cost of inaction?
Can you say the question one more time,
Yes.
please?
Okay. If we gather information on biodiversity globally, is it possible to use artificial intelligence to create a risk assessment framework? And do governments, like investors, act based on risk? So that's the first half.
Okay. Um, yeah. Um, yeah, artificial intelligence is really helpful, especially to look at these large, sometimes incongruous or incongruent data data sets. I would say artificial intelligence is still kind of, it's under development as much as, it's already out there. There's a lot kind of that remains to be seen on what it can and can't do. I would say I know from personal experience that so companies like Microsoft have a huge investment in decarbonizing all of their operations. And over the past, half decade or so, they've relied a lot on artificial intelligence in order to do that. Now, is it how they use it? I don't know. I'm not entirely sure. Um, but um, in terms of a risk assessment framework, I'd say probably. But there's also, a lot of these risk assessment frameworks. It's not like AI is suddenly enabling risk assessment frameworks. Those have been around for a good amount of time, and I think AI is really being used for more value in assess like actually doing the risk assessment based on the frameworks that are already made, not really creating novel risk assessment frameworks.
I would agree with that.
Um,
Yeah. And it's great at processing huge data sets. So this like potential global data set, it could be great at assessing and then implementing
yeah.
into perhaps like different framework options, but it would have to learn from existing framework structures, right?
Mhm.
It doesn't create from scratch.
Right. And it's also like um, like taking a huge burden off of, small and medium enterprises, because, risk assessment is it traditionally it's taken a lot of manpower, a lot of people power, a lot of time, and resources to do a lot of really in-depth risk assessment, and AI is automating a lot of that work, which in my opinion is a very good thing because it means more people can become aware. And as long as people continue learning, you know, what those risk assessment frameworks are, what they can and can't identify as risks, and what AI can and can't do with regard to filling out those risk assessments, I think it will be a long-term benefit.
Great.
Um,
And then the second
yeah,
half, and I'll just weigh in and you can let me know if you have anything to
sure.
add.
Okay.
It says, how do we define the cost of inaction? And I would say it's defined as loss and damage. So there's like the financial cost of climate mitigation, climate
Mm,
adaptation, and then loss and damage. And that is if we don't do anything, business as usual, what are we going to be experiencing in terms of, yeah, the loss that we would have? Would you have anything to add on that?
yeah, and I would also say for a lot of people, um, kind of on a less economic tone, it's really quite sentimental. Um, it's like what it's a question of what are we willing to give up, and why are we willing to give it up? Um, there's a lot of momentum behind us in terms of where we are already going, in the grand scheme of what climate change and what biodiversity loss means. Um, you can't decarbonize tomorrow and expect things to go well after that. Um, but that's just more reason to start decarbonizing today and to start being more intentional today. Um, so yeah, I mean, definitely look into, um, you're here because you're interested in biodiversity finance. I definitely encourage you to look more into how things are priced, and not priced. There's all sorts of great literature on the limitations of our current financial system, and where scholars and business leaders and government officials want it to go, or don't want it to go. So yeah, I highly encourage you to keep seeking that out.
Perfect. Thank you, Turner. And I think that's such a great
Thank
note
you.
to end on is it's more than just, the financial implications, it's this humanistic component as well. So I think we have to remember that and ground ourselves in that as well. Well, thank you again. Thank you for everyone for joining us and going a little bit
Yeah,
over.
everyone.
Great discussion. Thank you for all the questions. Tune in next month for our next Climate Live session. But if you have any other questions, feel free to reach out to myself or Turner. We'd be happy to chat with you.
Yes,
And thank you,
absolutely.
Turner, for joining us. It was so wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. Take care, everyone. Bye now.